Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Narrative Nest. Your support helps stories like mine reach the people who need them most. I woke up that morning before the alarm, the way a mother's body does when something important is about to happen. The sky outside my bedroom window was still a pale gray, the kind that feels like it's holding its breath. My daughter's wedding day had finally arrived. I lay there for a moment with my hand pressed against my chest, feeling my heart beat faster than it had in years. Pride, nerves, nostalgia, they all tangled together until I couldn't tell one from the other. My daughter, Ariba, was getting married. My baby. The little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who cried on her first day of school because her shoes felt too big for the world. And now she was about to walk down an aisle toward a man she believed would protect her heart the way I had tried to all her life. I got up quietly, careful not to wake my husband, and began the familiar routines that steadied me. Tea on the stove, dupatta folded just right. I whispered a short prayer the way my own mother had taught me, asking for blessings, for protection, for peace. At the time, I didn't know how desperately I would need that prayer to be answered. By the time we reached the bridal hall, it was already alive with motion. Makeup artists rushing, aunties arguing over seating, the hum of excitement vibrating through the walls, the smell of flowers and hairspray mixed with hot tea and perfume. Everywhere I looked, there were smiles, wide, hopeful smiles that made my chest ache. Ariba sat in the bridal room, surrounded by cousins and friends, her face glowing under layers of careful makeup. When she saw me, her eyes softened in that way that still made her look like my little girl. She reached out and squeezed my hand. Her fingers trembled. "Ami, do I look okay?" I swallowed past the lump in my throat and smiled. "You look beautiful," I said, and meant it with every piece of my soul. She smiled back, relief washing over her features. I smoothed the stray hair near her ear and kissed her forehead. In that moment, nothing felt wrong. Nothing warned me. If anything, I felt a quiet gratitude that her life seemed to be unfolding gently without the hardships I had endured. I stayed with her as long as I could until the room grew too crowded and too loud. At some point, I felt the pressure building behind my eyes, the kind that comes when emotions pile too high. I told her I needed a moment and slipped out, intending to find a quiet corner to breathe. The hallway outside the bridal room was dimmer, cooler. The noise faded to a distant echo. I walked slowly, my heels clicking softly against the floor, and let myself lean against the wall. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply. I told myself I was just overwhelmed, that this was normal, that mothers were supposed to feel like this on their daughters' wedding days. That was when I heard his voice. It came from a few steps away, muffled but unmistakable. The groom's voice, Samir, calm, confident, too calm. I hadn't meant to listen, I truly hadn't, but when you hear a familiar voice in an empty hallway, your attention sharpens without permission. I turned slightly, realizing he was standing just inside a side room, the door not fully closed. "I told you," he said, his tone low and irritated. "Once this is done, everything falls into place." There was another voice, too, male, unfamiliar. I couldn't make out the words at first. My heart started to beat faster, a strange unease crawling up my spine. "This marriage," Samir continued, "it's just a formality. Her family's connections alone make it worth it, and the money? Don't worry, I'll get what I'm owed." I felt my breath hitch. My hand gripped the edge of my dupatta. The other man said something I couldn't hear clearly, and Samir let out a short laugh. Not a happy laugh, a dismissive one. "She doesn't need to know everything," he said. "She's emotional. She'll believe whatever love story she wants. By the time she realizes the truth, it'll be too late." The hallway seemed to tilt. My ears rang. I leaned closer to the door without realizing I was moving, every instinct screaming at me to run and to stay at the same time. "And her mother?" the other man asked. Samir's reply came without hesitation. "Her mother won't suspect anything. Women like her are blinded by tradition, by rituals, by happy tears. She'll be too busy crying happy tears to see what's really happening." My knees weakened. If the wall hadn't been there, I would have fallen. In that moment, 1,000 memories flashed before my mind. Samir's polite smiles, his respectful greetings, the way he had looked at Ariba with what I thought was affection. I had trusted him. I had welcomed him into my home. And now I was standing in a hallway on my daughter's wedding day, listening to him reduce her life to a transaction. I didn't hear much after that. My ears buzzed, my thoughts roaring louder than his voice. All I could focus on was one terrifying truth. This marriage was a lie, and my daughter was about to step into it willingly. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might give me away. When I turned the corner, my legs finally gave out, and I had to grip a chair to steady myself. My reflection in a nearby mirror startled me. I looked pale, older, as if I had aged years in seconds. I wanted to scream, to burst back into that room and drag him out by the collar, to run to Ariba and tell her everything, consequences be damned. But another voice, quiet, steady, maternal, rose beneath the panic. "If you act without thinking, you may save your pride, but you could shatter her heart in front of everyone." I pressed my mouth to stifle a sob. This wasn't about me. This was about her future, about protecting her in a way that wouldn't scar her forever. I straightened slowly. I wiped my eyes, and as the shock settled into something colder, something sharper, a decision began to form. Samir thought I was blinded by tradition, by rituals, by happy tears. He was wrong. I had been a mother for over 25 years. I knew how to stay quiet. I knew how to wait, and I knew how to strike when it mattered most. If he believed this marriage would give him everything he wanted, I would let him believe it, right up until the moment the truth destroyed him. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and walked back toward the bridal room, my face carefully composed. Inside, the laughter continued, the music swelled. No one noticed the storm that had just taken root inside me. I returned to the bridal room with a smile that felt stitched onto my face. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, as if the floor itself knew what I was carrying. Ariba was laughing at something one of her cousins had said, her hands lifted carefully so her bangles wouldn't smudge the henna. The sound of her laughter cut through me sharper than any knife could have. I wondered, not for the first time, how something so beautiful could exist so close to something so cruel. I took my place beside her and pretended to fuss over her dupatta, straightening it where it didn't need straightening. My hands were steady, even though my insides felt like they were shaking apart. That steadiness surprised me. Somewhere between the hallway and this room, panic had given way to focus. I had no luxury of falling apart. Not today. Every few minutes, someone new entered the room with congratulations, blessings, instructions. Time moved strangely, both rushing and crawling. I listened more than I spoke, my mind replaying Samir's words over and over, searching for meaning, for context, for any explanation that could soften them. There was none. His tone had been too certain, too careless. He hadn't sounded like a man under pressure or confused about his feelings. He had sounded like a man counting his winnings. When Ariba finally stood to leave for the ceremony preparations, she hugged me tightly. I felt her heart pounding against mine. "Ami," she whispered again, "I'm scared." I closed my eyes and breathed her in, the familiar scent of rosewater and something uniquely hers. "That's normal," I said softly. "It means you care." I didn't say what I really wanted to say. that fear is sometimes the body's way of warning us. Instead, I kissed her cheek and let her go, watching as she was led away, her white dress glowing under the lights. I stood there long after she was gone, my hands clenched at my sides. The ceremony hall was filling quickly. Guests took their seats, the low murmur of conversation rising like a tide. Somewhere near the front, Samir stood with his family, dressed impeccably, smiling at well-wishers. I watched him from a distance, my gaze sharp and unblinking. Knowing what I knew now, every gesture felt rehearsed, every smile calculated. I didn't confront him, not then. Confrontation would have given him a chance to deny, to twist the story, to paint me as an over-emotional mother interfering in her daughter's happiness. Worse, it would have forced Ariba to choose between us in the most public, humiliating way possible. I couldn't do that to her. Instead, I began to observe. I noticed how Samir's phone never left his hand, how he kept glancing at it even as relatives congratulated him. I noticed the way his father spoke in hushed tones with a man I didn't recognize, their heads close together, expressions tight. I noticed how little Samir looked towards the entrance, towards the place where his bride would appear. A groom in love watches the door as if nothing else exists. Samir watched the crowd. I moved through the hall under the excuse of greeting guests, my ears open, my heart guarded. Years of managing family gatherings taught me how to listen without seeming to listen at all. Snippets of conversation floated past me, nothing incriminating, but enough to confirm my growing certainty that this wedding was as much a business arrangement as a celebration. At one point, I slipped outside to the courtyard, pretending to take a phone call. The air was cooler there, the noise muted. I leaned against a pillar and let myself feel the weight of what I was doing. I was planning an irreversible thing. Whatever I set in motion today would change lives, mine, my daughter's, and yes, even Samir's. My phone buzzed in my hand, a message from an unknown number. For a moment, my heart stuttered. Then I opened it. Everything ready, just follow the plan. I stared at the screen, confused. Then realization dawned, slow and chilling. That message wasn't meant for me. Samir had sent it to the wrong number. My fingers trembled as another message followed, this time meant for someone else, but delivered to me by mistake. Once the nikah is done, they can't back out. Papers will be signed next week. Make sure the account is prepared. I felt cold all over. There it was, proof, not just words overheard in a hallway, but written confirmation of his intentions. My breath came shallow as I took screenshots, my hands moving on instinct. Fate, it seemed, had decided to be thorough. I slipped my phone back into my purse just as a staff member stepped outside to call guests back in. The ceremony was about to begin. Inside, the lights dimmed slightly, music softening into something ceremonial. People rose from their seats, anticipation humming through the room. I took my place in the front row, my posture straight, my face serene. No one would have guessed that beneath my calm exterior, I was counting seconds. As I sat there, I thought of my own wedding decades ago. I had been young, hopeful, unaware of how much compromise marriage sometimes demanded. I had learned, slowly and painfully, that love without honesty becomes a cage. I had promised myself long ago that my daughter would never live inside one. When the doors at the back of the hall opened and Ariba appeared, a collective sigh rippled through the crowd. She was breathtaking. Tears filled my eyes, real tears this time, because even now, even knowing what I knew, I couldn't help but feel the gravity of the moment. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Samir turned to look at her. His smile widened, practiced, and smooth. Watching him, something inside me hardened completely. The officiant began the proceedings, his voice calm and measured. Words of commitment and trust filled the air, heavy with irony. I listened to every syllable, my mind ticking through a plan that was forming more clearly with each passing minute. I wouldn't stop the wedding before it began, not yet. Samir needed to feel secure. He needed to believe he had won. The proof was in my purse. The witnesses were in the room. All I needed now was the right moment. As the ceremony progressed, I glanced at the faces around me, relatives, friends, elders who believed they were here to bless a union built on love. I owed them the truth too, but more than that, I owed my daughter dignity. I met Ariba's eyes briefly. She smiled at me, nervous and radiant. I smiled back, a silent promise passing between us, though she didn't know it yet. I would not let this man ruin her life. And before this day was over, everyone would know exactly who he was. As the officiant's voice carried through the hall, my senses sharpened in a way I had never experienced before. Every sound felt amplified, the rustle of silk, the clearing of throats, the soft sniffles of emotional relatives. Time stretched, each second thick and deliberate, as though the universe itself was forcing me to sit inside this moment and fully understand it. Samir stood tall at the front, his hands folded respectfully, his expression one of solemn devotion. If I hadn't heard his confession with my own ears, I might have believed him. That was the most frightening part. Evil doesn't always announce itself with cruelty. Sometimes it wears good tailoring and rehearsed manners. My mind raced ahead, mapping out consequences. If I exposed him too early, he would deflect. If I waited too long, the legal bindings would tighten. The ceremony followed its order, sacred words wrapping around a lie. I could feel my pulse in my ears as the officiant reached the part where consent would soon be asked. I shifted slightly in my seat and reached into my purse, my fingers brushing against my phone. The screenshots felt heavier than the device itself, like proof weighed down by responsibility. This wasn't just evidence, it was a weapon, and weapons require precision. My husband leaned toward me, his voice low. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern flickering across his face. I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Just emotional," I replied. It wasn't a lie. Emotion was coursing through me, anger braided with fear, love burning hottest of all. The officiant paused to recite a blessing, and during that brief lull, my eyes drifted to Samir's parents. His mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, visibly moved. His father sat rigid, his jaw tight, eyes darting around the room. That man knew. I was certain of it. Perhaps he didn't know everything, but he knew enough to be uneasy. The realization steeled me further. This deception was not the work of one man alone. As the officiant prepared to ask Samir for his consent, I felt a sudden, unexpected calm settle over me. The chaos inside my chest quieted, replaced with clarity. I wasn't acting out of revenge, despite what this story might look like from the outside. I was acting out of love. That difference mattered. It shaped every decision I made next. "Before we proceed," the officiant said gently, "are there any matters that need to be addressed?" That question echoed through the hall, a formality meant for last-minute objections or logistical issues. My heart thudded, but I didn't move. Not yet. This wasn't the moment. Samir answered his consent without hesitation when asked, his voice confident, unwavering. The crowd murmured approvingly. My nails dug into my palms. When it was Ariba's turn, she spoke softly but clearly. "I do." Her words hit me like a physical blow. For a split second, doubt flickered. Was I about to destroy her happiness based on something I alone had witnessed? But then Samir's laughter echoed in my memory, his careless dismissal of my daughter's humanity, and the doubt evaporated. The officiant moved on, explaining the next steps, the legal formalities that would follow the ceremony. Papers, signatures, commitments that would be difficult to undo. My window was narrowing. I leaned toward my husband again. "I need you to trust me," I whispered. He looked at me, startled by the intensity in my voice. "No matter what happens next," I added quietly, "trust me." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. Years of marriage had taught me when my resolute was immovable. The officiant invited witnesses to stand, names being called one by one. I listened carefully, noting who was involved, who would later claim ignorance. This was no longer just about stopping a wedding. It was about exposing a network of calculated choices. As the witnesses settled, I rose from my seat. The movement drew attention immediately. Heads turned, whispers rippled. A few people smiled at me encouragingly, assuming I was about to offer a blessing or emotional speech. I walked forward slowly, my heart steady, my steps deliberate. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm but firm. The officiant paused, looking at me with polite confusion. "I need a moment." Samir's eyes locked on mine. For the first time that day, something flickered across his face that wasn't confidence. It was irritation, edged with uncertainty. "This won't take long," I continued, turning slightly so my voice carried through the hall. "But it's important." There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. Tradition frowned upon interruptions like this, but curiosity is powerful. No one stopped me. I reached into my purse and took out my phone, holding it loosely at my side for now. This morning, I accidentally overheard a conversation involving this marriage. A low murmur spread through the guests. Samir stepped forward. "Auntie," he said, forcing a smile, "this really isn't the time." I raised my hand gently, stopping him without raising my voice. "It is exactly the time." I turned toward the officiant. "Before any legal commitments are finalized," I said respectfully, "I believe the bride deserves the full truth." Ariba stared at me, confusion clouding her expression. "Ami," she whispered. I looked at her then, truly looked at her, and softened my tone. "Beta," I said, "what I'm about to say will be painful, but I need you to listen, not as a bride, as my daughter." Samir's jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, his first crack in his polished demeanor. "You're ruining everything." "Yes," I replied quietly, "I am." I turned back to the crowd. "The man standing here today," I said, "has admitted that this marriage is not based on love or commitment, but on money, connections, and personal gain." Gasps filled the hall. Samir's mother cried out his name, standing halfway from her seat. His father remained still, his face ashen. "That's a lie," Samir said loudly. "She's making it up." I nodded once. "That's what I expected you to say." I lifted my phone then, my hand steady despite the weight of the moment. "This is a message sent from your phone this morning, a message detailing plans to secure financial benefits after the wedding and stating clearly that backing out would be impossible once the ceremony was complete." I read the message aloud, every word landing like a hammer. The hall erupted into chaos. Voices overlapped. Someone shouted. Someone else sobbed. Samir lunged toward me. "Give me that," he shouted, his mask fully shattered now. My husband stepped between us instantly, his presence solid and protective. Others joined him, creating a barrier. I looked back at Ariba. Tears streamed down her face, her body trembling. My heart broke all over again, but I held her gaze, willing strength into her. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "I know this hurts, but this pain will pass. What would not have passed is the life he planned to trap you in." The officiant raised his hands, trying to restore order. "This ceremony cannot continue under these circumstances," he said firmly. Samir shouted something incoherent, his voice drowned out by the rising uproar. His family argued among themselves, guests whispered, some staring at me with shock, others with dawning understanding. I walked toward my daughter, taking her hands in mine. They were cold, shaking. "You are not alone," I told her. "You never will be." She looked at Samir one last time, then back at me. In that moment, I saw the child she had been and the woman she was becoming collide. She nodded, a small, brave movement. "I don't want this," she said, her voice breaking but clear. The words settled over the room like a final verdict. And just like that, everything Samir thought he had secured slipped through his fingers. The moment Ariba spoke those words, the hall seemed to exhale. It wasn't a peaceful release, it was a chaotic one, full of raised voices, scraping chairs, and the sharp crack of something precious breaking. But beneath all that noise, there was a clear, undeniable truth. The wedding was over. Samir stood frozen for a heartbeat, as if his mind hadn't yet accepted what his ears had heard. Then his face twisted, anger replacing shock. "You can't do this," he said, pointing at Ariba, his voice loud and desperate. "After everything that's been arranged, after all the money spent." "Enough," the officiant said firmly. "This ceremony is suspended. Please lower your voice." Samir ignored him, his composure completely gone now. "She's being manipulated," he insisted, gesturing toward me. "Her mother is poisoning her mind. This is family drama, not something to be aired like this." Family drama. The phrase stung, but it also clarified something for everyone listening. He was still trying to control the narrative, to minimize what had been revealed. I stepped forward again, my voice steady. "If this were family drama, Samir, it would have stayed within the family. But you made it public the moment you decided to turn my daughter's life into a transaction." His mother began to cry openly, clinging to a relative. "Samir, tell them it's not true," she pleaded. He didn't look at her. Guests murmured amongst themselves, some shaking their heads, others watching with a mixture of pity and judgment. A few stood up, clearly ready to leave, uncomfortable witnesses to a truth they hadn't expected to see. My husband placed a hand on Ariba's back, guiding her gently toward our family. She moved like someone in a dream, her eyes glassy, but she didn't resist. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her tightly, feeling the sobs rack her body. "I'm so sorry, Beta. I wanted to protect you from pain. I couldn't protect you from all of it." She clutched my clothes and cried, and I let her. I let her grief exist without rushing it away, even though every sob felt like it was tearing through me, too. The officiant spoke quietly with the hall manager, and soon staff began politely but firmly asking guests to disperse. The music had stopped. The flowers felt out of place now, their beauty mocking the mess of emotions hanging in the air. Samir's father finally stood, his voice tight. "We will discuss this privately," he said, more command than request. "This is not how these matters are handled." I met his gaze. "This is exactly how deception should be handled, in the light." He looked away, his shoulders slumping just slightly, as if the weight of what had been exposed was finally pressing down on him, too. As people filed out, some approached us quietly. A few women squeezed my hand, their eyes filled with understanding. "You did the right thing," one whispered. Others avoided eye contact, unsure how to respond. I didn't judge them. Not everyone knows how to stand in the aftermath of truth. Once the hall had mostly emptied, the space felt cavernous. The decorations remained, untouched, as if waiting for a celebration that would never arrive. I watched Samir from across the room as he argued in hushed tones with his parents, his gesture sharp and frantic. He looked smaller now, diminished by exposure. Security staff hovered nearby, ready to intervene if needed. The officiant approached us, his expression kind but serious. "I'm sorry for what you and your daughter have been through. You were brave to speak when you did." Brave. The word felt strange. I hadn't felt brave. I had felt necessary. We gathered our things quietly. Ariba's friends helped her remove the heavy jewelry, each piece placed back into its box with careful hands. Every clang of metal against metal sounded like a punctuation mark, ending a sentence that had nearly defined her life. When we stepped outside into the late afternoon light, the sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. It felt symbolic somehow, as if the day itself was acknowledging what had been lost and what had been saved. The ride home was silent. Ariba sat between her father and me in the back seat, staring out the window, her expression distant. I resisted the urge to fill the silence with reassurances. Some realizations need quiet to root. At home, the house felt familiar but foreign. Wedding gifts lined one wall, still wrapped, waiting for a future that would never arrive. I made tea, the simple act grounding me, anchoring me in something ordinary after such an extraordinary day. Ariba finally spoke as we sat together in the living room. "Did you really hear him say all that?" she asked softly, her eyes still red. "Yes," I replied, and then he confirmed it himself. She nodded slowly. I kept telling myself I was just nervous, that the doubt I felt was normal. I didn't want to disappoint anyone. Her words broke my heart in a new way. You never have to sacrifice your safety or your truth to meet someone else's expectations. Not mine, not anyone's. That evening, messages began pouring in, calls from relatives, some supportive, some accusatory. People wanted explanations, details, someone to blame. I answered only a few, choosing instead to stay close to my daughter. Later that night, after Ariba had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, my husband and I sat together in the quiet kitchen. "You knew," he said, not as a question. "I suspected," I replied, "and then I knew." He nodded, his expression a mix of admiration and sorrow. "You saved her," he said simply. I stared into my cup of tea, the steam curling upward. "I hope so," I said. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over yet. Exposing Samir at the altar stopped the wedding, but it hadn't stopped the consequences. There would be backlash. There would be attempts to shift blame, to rewrite the story. And I was ready for all of it. Because when you choose truth, you don't just face the lie, you face everyone who benefited from it. The days that followed felt heavier than the day of the wedding itself. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation drained away, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion. Our home became a quiet refuge and a battlefield at the same time. Phones rang endlessly. Messages poured in from relatives near and far, each one demanding a version of the story that made them comfortable. Some called to praise my courage. Others called to accuse me of ruining not just a wedding, but a family's reputation. I learned quickly who valued appearances over truth. I also learned who had lived long enough to recognize deception when they saw it. Ariba stayed in her room most of the time, emerging only to eat or sit silently with me in the evenings. I didn't push her to talk. Healing isn't something you can rush by asking the right questions. Sometimes it happens in the spaces between words. On the third day, Samir's mother came to our door. I saw her through the window first, standing on the porch with her purse clutched tightly to her chest, her eyes swollen from crying. For a moment, my instinct was to pretend I wasn't home. Then I remembered that courage doesn't end once the truth is spoken. I opened the door and invited her in. She sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, her posture rigid, as if the furniture itself might judge her. "I didn't know," she said immediately, her voice trembling. "I swear to you, I didn't know it was this bad." I listened quietly. Over the years, I had learned the difference between remorse and panic. Hers was a mixture of both. He told us it was a practical arrangement, that love would come later. You know how these things are sometimes. I nodded slowly. Practical arrangements still require honesty and consent. She lowered her head. He has shamed us, she whispered. The word shame echoed in the room, heavy with cultural weight. I chose my response carefully. What he did was shameful, I agreed, but the greater shame would have been allowing my daughter to suffer in silence. She looked up at me then, something like understanding flickering across her face. "What will you do now?" she asked. I thought of Ariba upstairs, her wedding dress still hanging in the closet, untouched. We will move forward, slowly, with honesty. Samir's mother left not long after, her apology incomplete but sincere enough to acknowledge. When the door closed behind her, I leaned against it and exhaled. That conversation drained me more than I expected. The backlash grew louder online. Someone leaked the story into family WhatsApp groups, twisting details, speculating motives. In one version, I was an overbearing mother who couldn't let go. In another, Ariba was painted as fickle, ungrateful. Each lie stung, but none of them surprised me. Ariba showed me her phone one evening, tears slipping silently down her cheeks as she scrolled. "They're saying I used him," she whispered, "that I wanted attention." I took the phone gently from her hands and set it aside. People who profit from silence will always punish those who speak. Their words don't define you. "But it still hurts," she said. "I know," I replied, pulling her into my arms, "and it's okay to admit that." One afternoon, a letter arrived. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. Samir. I hesitated before opening it, then unfolded the page slowly. His words spilled out in a messy blend of anger and self-pity. He accused me of destroying his future, of humiliating me unnecessarily. He claimed he had grown to care for Ariba and that I had misunderstood everything. The contradictions were almost laughable. At the bottom of the page, he wrote, "You could have handled this privately." I folded the letter back up and placed it in a drawer, my hands steady. Privacy is a privilege reserved for those who act with integrity. He had forfeited that the moment he chose deception. Weeks passed. The intensity of the public reaction faded, replaced by a quieter, more personal reckoning. Ariba began therapy, encouraged by both of us. Watching her take that step filled me with pride. Healing, I had learned, isn't passive. It's an act of courage in itself. One evening, as we sat together on the balcony watching the city lights flicker on, Ariba spoke with a clarity I hadn't heard in her voice since before the wedding. "I keep thinking about how close I was to losing myself, to becoming someone who tolerated being used because I thought that was my duty." I squeezed her hand. "You listened to the part of you that knew something was wrong, even if it took time." She nodded. "And you listened too." That acknowledgement settled something deep inside me. For the first time since the wedding day, I felt a sense of peace. But life has a way of testing resolve. Just when we began to breathe again, another challenge arrived, one that would force me to confront Samir not as a groom exposed at the altar, but as a man unwilling to accept consequences. A legal notice came in the mail, formal and cold. Samir was claiming defamation. He wanted to silence the truth after failing to bury it. I read the document carefully, my expression calm. Fear flickered briefly, then disappeared. I had evidence, witnesses, and most importantly, I had no regrets. When I showed the notice to Ariba, she stiffened. "What if he wins?" she asked quietly. "He won't, and even if he tried, we will stand together." Because this wasn't just about defending my actions anymore. It was about ensuring that no one could ever rewrite what happened as anything other than what it was, a mother choosing truth over comfort. And I was prepared to see it through to the end. The legal notice sat on our dining table for days. its crisp edges a constant reminder that truth often invites retaliation. I didn't rush to respond. I had learned that haste is what liars rely on, panic, emotional reactions, impulsive mistakes. I would give Samir none of those. Instead, I called a lawyer recommended by an old family friend. She was a sharp woman with kind eyes and a voice that carried quiet authority. When I told her everything, from the overheard confession to the messages and the public exposure at the altar, she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and nodded. "You didn't defame him," she said calmly. "You revealed him." Those words stayed with me. We gathered every piece of evidence, screenshots, call logs, witness statements from people who had heard Samir argue in the hall after the exposure. Even the officiant agreed to provide a written account of why the ceremony was halted. Each document felt like another brick in a wall of truth. Ariba watched quietly as I organized papers late into the night. "I hate that this is still happening," she said once, her voice tired. "I just want to move on." "I know," I replied, placing the papers into a folder. "But sometimes moving on requires standing still long enough to make sure the past can't chase you." The legal response was sent, clear, factual, unemotional. It stated that any further harassment would be met with counteraction. For the first time since the wedding, I felt the balance shift slightly back in our favor. Samir didn't stop immediately. He sent messages to extended relatives trying to gather sympathy, painting himself as a victim of a vindictive family. Some people believed him. That hurt, but it also clarified something important. Not everyone deserves access to your truth. Ariba, meanwhile, began to change in small but powerful ways. She cut her hair one afternoon, not dramatically, but decisively. "I needed something that feels like mine," she said, smiling faintly at her reflection. She started taking walks alone again, reclaiming spaces she had avoided since the wedding. One evening, she sat beside me on the couch and said, "I used to think strength was staying quiet. Now I know it's speaking even when your voice shakes." I looked at her and saw not a girl who had been saved, but a woman who had survived. The court date arrived sooner than I expected. I dressed simply that morning, choosing comfort over appearance. As we walked into the courthouse together, Ariba's hand slipped into mine just like it had when she was small. This time, I didn't feel fear. I felt grounded. Samir sat across the room, his posture rigid, his eyes avoiding mine. He looked tired, smaller than I remembered. For a moment, I wondered if he felt any remorse at all. Then I remembered that remorse requires accountability, and accountability had never been his strength. The proceedings were brief. The judge reviewed the evidence, listened to statements, and asked pointed questions. Samir's claims unraveled quickly under scrutiny. His lawyer's arguments sounded hollow in the face of documented proof. When it was over, the judge dismissed the case. Not only that, he issued a warning against further attempts at intimidation. As we stepped outside, the air felt lighter, as if something invisible had finally lifted. Ariba exhaled deeply, a sound that carried weeks of tension with it. "It's really over," she said. "Yes," I replied. "Now it is." We celebrated quietly that night, ordering food from her favorite place, laughing softly over shared memories. There was no grand triumph, no dramatic speech, just relief, just peace. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Ariba returned to work. I returned to routines I had neglected. The wedding gifts were donated to charity, each item finding a new home, a new purpose. It felt right. One afternoon, Ariba turned to me and asked, "Ami, do you ever regret how you handled it?" I considered the question carefully. "No," I said finally. "I regret that you were ever put in that position, but I don't regret choosing truth." She nodded, her eyes shining. "I hope one day I can be that brave for someone else." I told her, you already are. As time passed, the story faded from gossip to memory, but its lesson stayed sharp and clear. Love without honesty is not love. Tradition without integrity is not sacred, and silence when it protects harm is not virtue. I learned that day in the hallway, listening to a confession never meant for me, that motherhood doesn't end when your child grows up. It simply changes shape. Sometimes it looks like letting go, and sometimes it looks like standing up in a room full of people and saying, "No more." And if I had to do it again, knowing all it would cost me, I would still stand, because my daughter's future was worth everything. After the court case ended, something unexpected happened. The silence that followed was louder than all the noise that had come before it. For weeks, my phone barely rang. Family group chats went quiet. The same people who once had so much to say suddenly had nothing at all. At first, that silence felt unsettling, like waiting for another storm. But slowly, I began to understand it as something else. It was distance. And distance, I learned, can be a gift. Ariba and I started rebuilding our days in small, deliberate ways. We cooked together again, something we hadn't done since the wedding preparations had taken over our lives. We burned roadies, laughed at our mistakes, and talked about things that had nothing to do with betrayal or courtrooms. Sometimes, though, the past crept in quietly. One evening, as we folded laundry side by side, Ariba asked, "Ami, when you overheard him that day, did you ever think of staying quiet?" The question landed gently, but it carried weight. I folded a shirt slowly before answering. For a moment, I admitted, I thought about how much easier it would be. No scenes, no backlash, no pain in front of strangers. She looked at me, listening carefully. But then I imagined you 10 years from now, standing in a kitchen like this, wondering where you disappeared along the way, and I knew I couldn't choose comfort over your life. Her eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "I'm glad you didn't." That was the first time she said it so plainly, not "thank you," not "you saved me," just that simple acknowledgement. It healed something in me that I hadn't realized was still wounded. Not everyone stayed distant. A few relatives slowly returned, testing the ground with cautious messages and half apologies. Some admitted they had judged too quickly. Others avoided the topic altogether, as if pretending it never happened would erase their discomfort. I accepted what felt sincere and let the rest pass without confrontation. Peace, I had learned, doesn't require full closure from everyone. One afternoon, months later, I ran into Samir by accident. I was at a bookstore, standing in the aisle marked Self and Healing, flipping through a book I wasn't sure I needed but felt drawn to anyway. I sensed someone beside me before I saw him. When I turned my head, there he was. He looked different, thinner, tired. His confidence, once so polished, had dulled around the edges. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. "Hello," he said finally, his voice quieter than I remembered. "Hello," I replied. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "I just wanted to say, things didn't go the way I planned." I almost smiled at the understatement. "I know," I said calmly. He hesitated. "I lost a lot after that day." I studied him carefully. There was no accusation in his tone this time, but there wasn't real remorse either. Just loss, just frustration that the world hadn't bent the way he expected. "You didn't lose because I spoke. You lost because you lied." He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. For the first time, he had nothing to say. "I hope you learn from it, for your own sake." I turned away before he could respond, my heart steady. Walking out of that store, I realized something important. Seeing him no longer filled me with anger or fear or even satisfaction. He was simply a man who had made his choices and was now living with them. That, in itself, felt like closure. At home that evening, Ariba noticed my thoughtful mood. I told her about the encounter, watching her face carefully. She listened without tension, without the flinch I might have expected months earlier. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Free," I answered honestly. She smiled. "Me too." That word, free, meant more to me than any apology ever could. As time passed, Ariba began talking about her future again. Not marriage, not commitments, just her dreams. Traveling, advancing in her career, learning who she was without the pressure of becoming someone's wife. I listened with quiet pride, grateful that her life was once again open-ended. One night, as we sat on the rooftop under a soft sky, she said, "You know, Ami, I used to think a good daughter was one who never caused trouble. Now I think a good daughter is one who doesn't abandon herself." I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "And a good mother," I said, "is one who teaches her that, even if it means standing alone." We sat there in silence, the city breathing around us, both of us changed in ways that couldn't be undone. Sometimes people ask me if I was afraid that day at the wedding. The truth is, I was. I was terrified. Not from Samir, not from gossip, not even from consequences. I was afraid of failing my daughter when it mattered most. Courage doesn't arrive without fear. It arrives carrying fear with it, asking you to move anyway. That day, I didn't act because I was strong. I acted because love left me no other choice. And if there is one lesson my story leaves behind, it's this. Tradition should never demand your silence. Love should never require your disappearance. And a mother's instinct, when guided by truth, can change the course of the life. The year that followed taught me something no book or sermon ever had. Healing doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as ordinary days. It looks like waking up without dread, like laughter returning without guilt, like memories losing their sharp edges and becoming stories you can hold without bleeding. Ariba healed in layers. Some days she was light and energetic, filling the house with music again, humming while she cooked. Other days she was quiet, thoughtful, retreating inward to process things that had no easy words. I learned not to rush her through either version of herself. Both were necessary. Both were honest. One afternoon, months after everything had settled, she brought the wedding dress out of the closet. For a moment, my chest tightened. That dress had once represented hope, then heartbreak. She laid it carefully across the bed, smoothing the fabric with her hands. "I don't want to keep it like this," she said. "Not as something painful." I waited, letting her lead. "I want to donate it," she continued. "Maybe someone else can wear it with joy, without knowing its history." I nodded, emotions swelling in my throat. That's a beautiful idea. As we folded it together, I realized what she was really doing. She wasn't erasing the past, she was transforming it, taking something that nearly trapped her and turning it into an act of generosity. That was strength. Not the loud kind, but the enduring kind. The day we donated it, we didn't make a ceremony of it. We simply handed it over, wished the woman luck, and walked away. Outside, Ariba took a deep breath and smiled. "I feel lighter," she said. "So do I replied. People sometimes assume that after a story like mine, bitterness lingers, that revenge hardens you. But the truth is, my heart didn't grow colder, it grew clearer. I stopped confusing silence with peace. I stopped believing that endurance was the same as virtue. And most importantly, I stopped apologizing for choosing my child over other people's comfort. I was asked once at a family gathering long after the dust had settled, "Do you think you went too far?" The room went quiet. eyes turned towards me, curious, cautious. I smiled gently and said, "I think I went exactly as far as I needed to." No one argued. Ariba's relationship with herself became the most beautiful thing to witness. She learned to say no without explanation, to trust her instincts, to walk away from conversations that diminished her. Watching her grow into that confidence felt like watching the sun rise after a long night. You don't rush it, but when it's there, you feel grateful just to witness it. One evening, she sat beside me and said, "If I ever get married someday, I won't do it to prove anything. I'll do it because it feels safe." That word, safe, meant everything. And I knew then that whatever happened next in her life, she would never again mistake control for care or tradition for truth. As for me, I found a new kind of peace in my role as a mother, not the anxious peace of constantly worrying, but the grounded peace of knowing I had done my duty when it mattered most, that no matter how the world judged me, my conscience was quiet. Sometimes, late at night, I think back to that hallway, the partially open door, the confession never meant for my ears. I think about how close I came to walking away, convincing myself it wasn't my place, and I shudder, because one moment of hesitation could have rewritten my daughter's entire life. We often tell women to endure, to be patient, to wait for things to improve. But there are moments, rare and critical, when endurance becomes betrayal, when waiting becomes abandonment, and when love demands action, not silence. That day, I chose action, not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted justice served with spectacle, but because motherhood at its core is a promise to protect, to guide, to stand between your child and harm when you can, even if it means standing alone. If you're listening to this story and you find yourself at a crossroads, hearing something you wish you hadn't, knowing something you wish weren't true, I want you to remember this. Discomfort is temporary. Regret can last a lifetime. Truth has a way of breaking things, but it also has a way of breaking chains. My daughter is free today because the truth was spoken before it was too late. And I carry that knowledge with quiet pride, knowing that on the most important day of her life, I didn't just watch her walk to the altar, I walked her back to herself. That is the kind of ending every mother hopes for, even if the road there is nothing like the one she imagined.